We have looked so far at the putting up of the veil. And the veil basically shows the spiritual death of man. He has been shut out from the very presence of God. What I want to look at now is the tearing or the rending of the veil. Notice Hebrews 9:6 here says, "These preparations having thus been made," and what he's talking about here is the building of the tabernacle, "the priests go regularly into the first section performing their ritual duties. But into the second only the high priest goes, and he but once a year, and not without taking blood, which he offers for himself and for the unintentional sins of the people." After the tabernacle was built, the priests could go into the first section to perform their ritual duties, but they could not go into the second section where God dwelt above the mercy seat. Only Aaron could go in there, and he but once a year on the Day of Atonement. And even then he must take blood. In verse 9, in chapter 9 and verse 8, he says, "By this the Holy Spirit indicates that the way into the holy places is not yet opened as long as the first section is still standing, which is symbolic for the present age." The only way into the holy places is not open as long as that first section is still standing. Therefore, what God removed by the tearing of the veil was to remove the first section. This was the place where the Old Testament priests ministered to God for the people. When the veil was torn, this room was no longer needed. There is now a new heavenly high priest, and every believer now becomes a priest. No more sacrifices on the altar. No more burned incense in the holy place. No more bread to put on the table. No more lighting of the candlestick. With the tearing of the veil, all of this was removed. It is no longer needed to get into the presence of God. Now that the veil has been torn in two, there is only one section. So now if one enters into that first door, he is in the Holy of Holies, into the very presence of God. Now the book of Hebrews is written under the auspices of a torn veil, and I needed to establish that point first. And that point is this. Let me repeat myself. Now for us in this dispensation to go through the door is to go directly into the most holy place, into the very presence of God. There now stands only one barrier for the Christian to enter into the very presence of God, and we're going to study that barrier in the next lesson as we look. When Jesus therefore had received the vinegar, he said, "It is finished." And he bowed his head and gave up the ghost. Look at what Mark says in 15:37. "And Jesus cried with a loud voice and gave up the ghost. And the veil of the temple was rent in twain from the top to the bottom." When Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "It is finished," and died, Mark says that the veil of the temple was ripped from the top to the bottom, signifying that it was God who ripped it apart. The veil here becomes very symbolic. And let's see what Matthew says about this tearing of the veil. "And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from the top to the bottom, and the earth shook, and the rocks were split." Since the earth was cursed when the veil was put up, it's as if the cursed earth is rejoicing at the news of the redemption of man. By the veil being torn in two, the cherubim were not removed, but they were moved aside to allow entrance. Now I think this is important that we don't say the veil was removed. Because if God had removed the veil, that would have signified that he had changed the requirements for entry. By removing the cherubim, he would have said that holiness was no longer needed to enter in. But by ripping the veil and leaving the cherubim, it shows that the requirements are still the same, but now a way has been made through those requirements. A way has been made that will satisfy both the cherubim Notice something else that happened when the veil was torn in two. The tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared unto many. Notice that something else here happened. All the Old Testament saints were sleeping until Jesus died. They were awaiting this time of their redemption. But as soon as he died, many graves were opened, and many were raised with Christ in the resurrection. This was the first fruits of the Old Testament saints. This signified that the Old Testament saints had now been redeemed. Hebrews tells us what happened. When the death of Jesus and the tearing of the veil, the Old Testament saints have now received redemption. Let's look at Hebrews, and as he talks this. Therefore he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance. Notice this now. Since a death has occurred that redeems them, that's the Old Testament saints, from the transgressions committed under the first covenant. We see here in this verse that the Old Testament saints were not redeemed until Jesus said, "It is finished," and died. That's when the graves opened. All of their sins that had now, up to now, only been rolled back, had now been forgiven. They had been sleeping in the grave until this death took place. The opening of the tombs and many raised as first fruits of the resurrection of all of the Old Testament saints. First fruits, then, is God's preview of a greater promised resurrection, both for them and for those now under the new covenant. In Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 24, for Christ has entered not into the holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. The tearing of the veil represents the establishment of a greater high priest. A high priest not after the order of Aaron, but after the order of Melchizedek, the priest of the Most High God. You remember back when we covered Melchizedek that he was pictured as a king. And that's how Matthew presents him. You remember the king as king. He was king of Salem, or king of peace. Remember also that Melchizedek was a servant, as Mark presents Christ as the servant who came to give his life as a ransom for many. Melchizedek was a servant. He brought Abraham food and wine. You remember that Melchizedek was pictured as deity, just as John presents him in his gospel. Abraham bowed before him and received a blessing. He is pictured as a perfect man. Remember that Abraham paid tithes to him as that greater man than he was. This is how the Gospels present Christ as king, just as Melchizedek was presented there. So he is Christ now is a priest after the order of Melchizedek. Matthew as king, Mark as servant, Luke as the perfect man, and John as the perfect God. This is now our new high priest, established in heaven to make intercession for us. In Hebrews 10:14 it says, "For by a single offering he has perfected for all time," now, all time, both the Old Testament and the New Testament, those who For since the law has but a shadow of the good things to come, instead of the true form of these realities, it can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually being offered every year, make perfect those who draw near. The Old Testament saint was never made perfect, and therefore was kept out of the holy place by a veil. He could not enter into God's presence because he had not been perfected. I want you to notice that I'm going back here to John to show you something here. In John chapter 14 and verse 16, he says, Jesus is speaking here to his disciples, and he says, "I will ask the Father, and he will give you another helper to be with you forever, even the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive, because it neither sees him nor knows him. You know him, for he dwells with you and will be in you." We often mistake the Gospels as being New Testament or New Covenant. But in the Gospels, the disciples were still actually living outside the veil. We need to be careful that we decipher the Gospels under the auspices of being outside the veil. The veil was still up when they were walking with Jesus. What Jesus was saying in the Gospels was being spoken to people behind the veil, and it must be interpreted in that light. Jesus was with them and not in him. He says, "You know him, for he now dwells with you, but he will be in you." Now this is what happened at Pentecost. Jesus said there was going to be coming a time when I will be in you. And at Pentecost, that is when this happened. And Jesus inferred here that it is more important for him to be in them than it is for him to be with them. He has been with them up to now, but he says, "I shall be in you." Notice that the indwelling Christ is still future. The veil has not as yet been torn in two. Now this, in John 7:39, I want you to look at this. "Now this he said to the disciples about the Spirit, whom those who believed in him were to receive, for as yet the Spirit had not been given, because Jesus was not yet glorified." The tearing of the veil represents the glorification of Christ. Everything was dependent on Christ being glorified. Until Christ was glorified, he could not return and be in them. Now Pentecost, as we looked at earlier, was the ringing of the bell. Pentecost is the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. God breathed back into man his presence. They were baptized with the Holy Spirit. Christ himself came to take up residence in them. They received spiritual life. The tree of life But when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation, he entered once for all into the holy places, not by the means of the blood of bulls and goats and calves, but by the means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. The tearing of the veil opened up a new covenant. Not an earthly covenant of law and grace, of law and works, but a heavenly covenant of grace and blessings.